Battle of Coruscant, 19 BBY. The sky above the Republic capital is so thick with ships it barely qualifies as sky anymore. Nearly 1,000 Venator-class Star Destroyers holding a defensive perimeter while Separatist cruisers push in from every angle, laser fire crossing in both directions at a rate no individual pilot can track. The whole engagement a controlled chaos of burning hulls and evasive maneuvers conducted across 3 dimensions simultaneously. Somewhere inside that, an ARC-170 takes a direct hit. The hull ruptures across the port S-foil assembly. The ship loses attitude control and begins to tumble, trailing atmosphere from a breach the crew has maybe 10 seconds to patch before the systems cascade. Anakin Skywalker sees it. He starts to break formation, starts to move toward the stricken crew. Obi-Wan Kenobi's voice comes across the comm. Stay on mission. The camera follows the Jedi. 3 clone pilots and their astromech droid vanish from the story before anyone watching even had time to register their names. Because they didn't have names. Not in this film. Not in this framing. Not in a story that always had somewhere more important to be. That sequence runs for maybe 8 seconds. It's the ARC-170's most significant moment in the entire Star Wars film canon. The ARC-170 never got the attention it deserved. A 3-seat heavy starfighter with its own astromech socket, a hyperdrive, and enough firepower to operate independent of any fleet. Built for exactly the kind of story Star Wars never bothered to tell. One film. One battle sequence where it functions as a visual demonstration of scale before the camera returns to the Jedi. The Clone Wars animated series places it in fleet backgrounds and planetary engagements across multiple seasons. But across the entire run of that show, no episode builds its narrative around an ARC-170 crew. In Legends novels, it appears primarily as equipment. In The Last of the Jedi, a group of characters escape Naboo in one modified ARC-170 starfighter, with its hyperdrives overhauled, tool rather than protagonist. In The Rise of Darth Vader, squadrons of them fall from the clouds, cannons blazing. Background action in someone else's story. Only one pilot is ever named in the films at all, Commander CC-2237, callsign Oddball, who coordinates a single handoff with Obi-Wan Kenobi during the Battle of Coruscant and then folds back into the fleet, his databank entry confirming he flew at Teth, Umbara, and Coruscant across multiple ship types and never quite became the center of anything. That list is the complete canon record of a ship carrying enough weaponry and range to function as an independent warship. The brevity makes the argument without requiring elaboration. The previous video left off with Incom Corporation and Subpro Corporation developing the ARC-170 as the Clone Wars began. That partnership's roots go back much further. The Z-95 Headhunter was their joint creation too, designed years before the invasion of Naboo. Single seat, 4 engines, built for a galaxy that hadn't yet needed anything heavier. It was a flexible, widely deployed platform, cheap enough for civilian operators, capable enough for system defense forces, present across so many corners of the galaxy that it became almost invisible. The Z-95 was the background ship of the pre-war era, in the same way the ARC-170 became the background ship of the Clone Wars. The official Star Wars databank establishes the design family in plain terms, noting that the narrow space frame flanked by large engines is characteristic of the Incom and Subpro combined output, visible in the PTB-626 planetary bomber and the NTB-630 naval bomber, and in the Z-95 itself. Same corporate DNA, same structural logic, but the requirements that drove the ARC-170's development had nothing to do with the world that made the Z-95 viable. The Z-95 carried 4 engines and a single pilot. It could be fitted with a hyperdrive, but plenty of operators never bothered, because plenty of Z-95 missions never took the ship far enough from its base to need one. When the Clone Wars arrived, and the Republic needed a fighter capable of operating in contested space without carrier support, a fighter that could transit independently, engage targets larger than other starfighters, and bring its crew back from missions that had no guarantee of nearby friendly infrastructure. Incom and Subpro didn't start from nothing. They went back to the space frame they'd already refined and rebuilt the requirements around it. 2 larger engines replaced the 4 smaller units, concentrating thrust through a narrower drive profile. The fuselage widened and lengthened to accommodate 3 crew in a tandem arrangement. Pilot forward, co-pilot/gunner at the midship station, tail gunner facing aft in the rear cockpit. Folding S-foil assemblies were added to the wing structure, movable flight surfaces that opened for combat and atmospheric operations and locked closed for cruise configuration, serving 3 distinct functions simultaneously: heat dissipation from the engines, additional stability during atmospheric flight, and mounting points for the wing-mounted laser cannons operated by the co-pilot. The Z-95 and the ARC-170 share engineering DNA rather than a parent-child relationship. They came from the same design house, built by the same corporate partnership, with the same foundational space frame logic visible in both hulls. But the ARC-170 was an answer to questions the Z-95 was never asked. Incom then carried that lineage 1 generation further. The T-65 X-Wing, the fighter that became the symbol of the Rebel Alliance, is the ARC-170's direct successor in Legends. The S-foil mechanism made the full journey, from the ARC-170's wing-mounted laser pylons to the X-Wing's signature 4-wing deployment that defined a silhouette for generations of viewers. The astromech socket made the same transition: pilot plus droid in a dorsal fuselage mount, handling navigation and in-flight repairs. The same operational pairing carried forward across the rupture between Republic and Imperial eras. 3 ships, 1 corporate lineage, spanning the entire prequel to original trilogy arc. Most people know the beginning of that sequence and its end. The ARC-170 is the chapter in between, and it's the one that does the most engineering work. The full designation is Aggressive Reconnaissance 170 Starfighter, which tells you considerably more than the acronym does. The ship was built to push deep into enemy-controlled space, gather intelligence on system defenses and fleet positions, and fight its way back out when something tried to stop it. The aggressive half of that name was operational specification. At 12.71 meters in length, with a 20-meter wingspan when the S-foils are fully deployed, the ARC-170 is a substantial airframe by starfighter standards. Heavier, wider, and more complex than the interceptors the Republic flew alongside it. The Eta-2 Actus measured barely 5.47 meters, stem to stern. The Alpha-3 Mimbus V-wing occupied a similar footprint. Both were built around a specific design philosophy: sacrifice shields, sacrifice heavy armament, sacrifice any independent hyperdrive capability, and, in exchange, gain the kind of thrust-to-mass ratio that let a skilled pilot push the airframe to its absolute mechanical limits. For Anakin Skywalker or Obi-Wan Kenobi, that was a rational bargain. Force-sensitive pilots could compensate for vulnerability through perception and reaction times that standard clone pilots simply didn't have. An Eta-2 in the hands of a Jedi general was a threat. An Eta-2 in the hands of a clone trooper, operating without force instincts, without a carrier in range, in a system 3 jumps from the nearest friendly installation, was something considerably more fragile. The ARC-170 made the opposite engineering choice. It wasn't trying to be an interceptor. It was built to be a warship that could fit inside a Venator's hangar bay. The armament configuration requires a full accounting, because each position represents a separate crew role with separate responsibilities. The co-pilot, Station 2, positioned behind and slightly below the pilot in the tandem cockpit arrangement, operates 2 medium laser cannons mounted on the S-foil assemblies, fire-linked for simultaneous discharge. Wide convergence angle, sustained rate of fire, the effective forward battery of the ship. That station belongs entirely to the second crew member. The pilot's job is to fly, They don't also run the guns. Below the main starframe, running under the fuselage beneath the cockpit stations, sits a proton torpedo launcher carrying a 6-round magazine. 6 shots at anti-capital ship yield, built directly into a hull that could land on a carrier flight deck. The Eta-2 carried no torpedo capability. The Alpha-3 Nimbus carried no torpedo capability. An ARC-170, operating alone in a contested system, could threaten a cruiser in ways that either of those ships fundamentally couldn't. Then there is the tail station. The third crew member faces aft and operates 2 additional laser cannons in a dorsal turret configuration, tracking targets independently of the ship's heading. A vulture droid, or a droid tri-fighter, that achieved gun position behind an ARC-170, the kill position in nearly every starfighter engagement, would find itself looking at a dedicated tracking weapon, crewed by a specialist with no other assignment. The ship covered every firing arc simultaneously. That isn't a capability any other Republic fighter in standard deployment shared. Deflector shields came fitted as standard equipment, and the distinction matters beyond the obvious protective value. The Eta-2 carried minimal shielding. The Alpha-3 Nimbus operated essentially without it. During high-speed atmospheric operations, the ARC-170's deflector system performed a second function. Distributed across the hull's surface, the shields dissipated the friction heat generated by moving a 12.71-meter airframe through dense planetary atmosphere at combat speeds. This is the technical mechanism that allowed the ship to reach the atmospheric performance figures the Star Wars head-to-head reference book records, 1,050 kilometers per hour at operating altitude. That is, a fighter moving at close to supersonic velocity through a planetary atmosphere, carrying 6 proton torpedoes and a 3-person crew, protected by a deflector system that was also serving as its heat management solution. The hyperdrive is the specification that separates the ARC-170 from virtually the entire remaining Republic fighter complement with a single figure, Class 1.5. Period-era reference material on the ship is direct about the significance. It was one of the few starfighters of the Clone Wars era to carry an onboard hyperdrive at all, with an effective range of approximately 5,000 light-years per jump, and navigation memory sufficient for 10 stored jump calculations managed through the astromech droid in the dorsal socket. The Eta-2 carried no hyperdrive. The Alpha-3 Nimbus carried no hyperdrive. Without access to a carrier vessel making the transit for them, those ships stayed in whatever system the last battle had ended in. An Eta-2 pilot separated from her Venator wasn't inconvenienced. She was stranded, waiting for recovery, whatever the tactical situation required of her in the meantime. A crew aboard an ARC-170, cut off from their carrier, had options. Class 1.5 drive, 5 days of consumables aboard, the astromech in the dorsal socket managing jump calculations, while the 3 crew focused on combat and navigation decisions. A mission could carry them through multiple transits across a contested region, conducting reconnaissance across several systems, before returning to Republic space without refueling. No other fighter in the Republic Navy could claim that operational independence. One detail about the astromech position deserves explicit attention. The socket arrangement in the dorsal fuselage is the same design logic INCOM would later carry forward into the T-65 X-Wing, R2 or R4 series droid, managing navigation, monitoring ship systems, conducting emergency repairs during flight while the human crew ran the combat functions. The droid wasn't a co-pilot in the Jedi starfighter sense. It was the ship's logistics officer, handling the mechanical complexity of operating alone in deep space so the people inside could concentrate on surviving the engagement. 3 specialized crew, full deflector shields, 6 proton torpedoes, 4 laser cannons covering both forward and aft arcs, a hyperdrive rated for 5,000 light-years with 5 days of consumables backing it up, and an astromech managing the navigation. The Republic designed a fighter capable of surviving alone in hostile space, armed to threaten targets an order of magnitude larger than itself, and crewed by 3 people who had to function as a coordinated unit to operate its weapons at all. Most Republic starfighters were single-pilot platforms, which means most Republic pilots were fundamentally alone in combat. One person, one droid socket, a cockpit measured in cubic meters, whatever the engagement brought. The ARC-170 demanded something different, and that difference sits at the center of every conversation about what the ship was actually built for. 3 human beings sealed inside the same hull. The pilot managed the airframe, controlling flight maneuvers and overall tactical positioning. The co-pilot ran the wing cannons, an independent fire control role with no relationship to flying the ship. The second crew member could be tracking and engaging a separate target while the pilot was maneuvering through incoming fire. The tail gunner faced backward, tracking threats in the aft arc that the pilot couldn't see, and the co-pilot's forward-facing guns couldn't reach. Each position covered a function the other 2 couldn't perform. Lose one crew member, and the ship became measurably less capable in ways that couldn't be compensated by redistribution. A 2-person ARC-170 with the tail station empty had an undefended rear quarter in a combat environment specifically populated by enemies that attacked from behind. James Luceno's Legends novel, The Rise of Darth Vader, captures the internal weight of that arrangement in a brief fragment of dialogue. Characters aboard an ARC-170 are discussing what taking control of the ship would require.
We may have to stun the co-pilot and tail gunner.
3 separate human beings, each capable of independent action, each a factor in who actually controls the vessel. The line makes explicit what the 3-cockpit design implies. There is no single point of authority, the way there is in a single-pilot fighter. The ship distributes agency across its crew, along with its weapons. 3 people on a 5-day consumable supply, sealed into a hull not much longer than a city bus, running missions that took them far enough from friendly support that returning to base wasn't a guaranteed option. That isolation generates something no single-pilot fighter can produce: actual relationships under pressure, actual dependency on people who can't be replaced by punching a different heading into the navicomputer. ARC-170 crews knew each other across extended operations in ways that fighter pilots cycling on and off carrier decks never could. Legends came part way to this premise. In The Last of the Jedi, set in the immediate aftermath of Order 66, 3 characters, Trevor, Keats, and Solace, escape Naboo in one modified ARC-170, with its hyperdrives freshly overhauled. They're not clone troopers. They're civilians and a former Jedi, moving through a galaxy where Republic-era hardware is beginning to attract Imperial attention. The ship functions exactly as designed: independent transit, 3-person crew, a 5,000 light-year drive, taking people somewhere the new government would prefer they not go. The ARC-170 becomes a vessel for people who no longer belong to the world they grew up in. Set that scenario at the exact moment that world ended. An ARC-170 crew on extended reconnaissance, deep in a contested system, drive at full charge, 5 days of consumables barely touched, and Order 66 comes through the holonet. 3 clone pilots, trained for loyalty to the Republic since the day they were grown. No Venator in communication range, no Jedi General aboard to receive the order, no immediate chain of command to process what the transmission is actually asking them to do. Just 3 people in a self-sufficient ship, deciding in real time who they are when no one is watching, and the galaxy just changed its definition of what they're supposed to be. That question, what would they do? Where would they go? What would they find when they finally came back? Is exactly the kind of question a ship with a 5-day range and a 3-person crew makes possible to ask. Drop your answer in the comments. A standard Venator-class Star Destroyer, by Legends-era specifications, carried a total fighter complement of 420 aircraft, distributed in a deliberate tactical arrangement: 192 V-Wing, or V-19 Torrent starfighters, 192 Eta-2 Actis interceptors, and at least 36 ARC-170 starfighters. The Eta-2s represented the fast attack component, Jedi-piloted, extreme agility, no hyperdrive, entirely dependent on the Venator for any inter-system movement. The V-Wings and V-19s handled screening and sustained attrition operations, numbers-based coverage where individual survival was less critical than maintaining a presence across the engagement. The 36 ARC-170s were the heavy element, and uniquely, the only aircraft in that entire complement capable of continuing operations if the carrier was disabled or destroyed. That survivability wasn't incidental. The tactical logic built around ARC-170 independence allowed for pre-engagement reconnaissance that carrier-dependent fighters couldn't conduct. Before a Venator task force transited to a contested system, ARC-170 squadrons could jump ahead on their Class 1.5 drives, assess the tactical situation, enemy fleet positioning, orbital defense installations, patrol patterns, minefields along expected approach vectors, and transmit that data before the capital ships arrived. The Venator's Class 1.0 hyperdrive rating meant the main fleet could cross equivalent distances faster than its ARC-170 complement. But the critical factor was that the ARC-170s could make the crossing at all, independently, without authorization from or coordination with the carrier. They could act on their own and relay what they found. In formation doctrine, ARC-170s operated as the central heavy unit, typically flanked by lighter fighters handling interception and attrition at the engagement's edges. Their shields absorbed fire that would have destroyed an Eta-2. Their proton torpedoes threatened targets heavier than standard starfighters, allowing a combined formation to threaten capital ship targets that a pure interceptor wing couldn't approach effectively. Their tail guns provided rear arc coverage for the entire formation, not just the individual ship. Cannon gave this doctrine one meaningful illustration. At the Battle of Malastare, ARC-170s flew close escort for BT-LBY wing bombers during the electro-proton bomb deployment, while simultaneously conducting strafing operations against Separatist ground forces. Heavy fighter covering a dedicated heavy bomber during a precision strike, layered on top of active ground interdiction, executed in a single coordinated sortie. Multiple overlapping functions, one aircraft type, because the design specification assumed the crew would need to be capable of all of them at once. What never made it to screen was the full integrated version of that doctrine. ARC-170 squadrons transiting ahead, mapping an engagement, feeding coordinates back to the fleet, then joining the main battle as the heavy screening element, while Eta-2s ran intercept and V-Wings handled attrition. The tactical architecture existed. The ship existed. The story never did. The Empire declined to continue ARC-170 production after the Clone Wars ended. Surviving hulls operated on a limited basis through the early Imperial period and simply weren't replaced when they were lost. The new military philosophy had no use for an aircraft this expensive, this crew-intensive, and this capable of operating without supervision for 5 days at a stretch. TIE fighters carried no hyperdrives. Certain configurations carried no life support beyond what pilots needed for a short engagement. Produced cheaply, deployed in numbers large enough that attrition became irrelevant, the Imperial model inverted every design principle the ARC-170 represented. Where the Republic had built fighters capable of surviving alone in hostile space, the Empire built fighters designed to be indistinguishable from each other and replaceable before the debris from the last one had finished cooling. A crew that could operate independently for 5 days, without orders from a capital ship, with enough range to transit to a system the fleet hadn't authorized. That was a crew the Imperial doctrine had no interest in fielding. The ARC-170 outlasted those assumptions anyway. Shara Bey flew one during the Galactic Civil War. Nora Wexley flew one. Thane Kyrell and Braylon Stram both have confirmed canon histories with the type during the Rebellion-era conflict. Decades after the Clone Wars, pilots were still willing to crew a ship requiring 3 trained specialists and a droid just to operate at full capacity, because the fundamental design was sound enough to remain operationally relevant across a generation of warfare it wasn't originally built for. The ARC-170 didn't become obsolete. It was phased out by people who found what it represented inconvenient. A ship that capable, that deliberately built around the assumption that its crew might need to survive alone in hostile space for nearly a week. It deserved more than 8 seconds and a background role. The ship that carried all 36 of those ARC-170s into every major engagement of the Clone Wars. The 1,137-meter Venator-class Star Destroyer, designed by Lyra Blissix, constructed by Kuat Drive Yards. The carrier that anchored Republic fleet doctrine from Geonosis to the end of the war, and has appeared in more viewer comments than any other ship in this series, has never had its own dedicated breakdown. That gap is next. Subscribe so you don't miss it.